Hi, this is Terry Allen. It is March 5th, 2023, and this is Real Progress News. I have my guest, Gerald Pechenuk, and he is a longtime associate with Lyndon LaRouche and LaRouche PAC, and he is one of the executive investigators, I guess, journalists at the organization.
All around troublemaker, I think, would probably be a better description.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's a lot of stuff happening. We've got, this insane Ukraine, Russia war. So what can you tell us about what's going on right now?
Well, according to a discussion that friends of mine were having do reside in the region of Donbass, the interviews, George Eliason, who's an American who said we're entering a situation where NATO, NATO, NATO is supplying weaponry to the Unions. And there was just an incident where Ukrainian kind of special forces went over the border Russia and created a terrorist incident in the areas. And what Mr. Bison was discussing is this is really the Ukrainians are not doing too good in the war. They've lost, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and the states is this going to be a long war? Is war going to end soon? When is it going to end? Right now, I think, and we can discuss this more, really the only it's going to end is if we get rid of the British influence, empire, globalist, imperial policy, which ironically, Terry, on this day in 1946, so we're talking about 423, 77 years ago today, Winston Churchill, British, eugenics supporter, colonialist supporter par excellence, who was having major fights during World War Franklin Roosevelt. And many of your listeners may not know, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt had bitter disagreements, very bitter disagreements, primarily around what would the post-war world look like, whereas Churchill emphasized turn to the British colonial empire system, and Franklin Roosevelt, who again people don't know, his family, his great grandfather, somewhere generations ago, was known as Isaac the Patriot Roosevelt, who was a direct collaborator with Alexander Hamilton in the found first bank of the United States, which was a critical element in how the United States, after defeating the British Empire in the Revolutionary War, was able to take 13 separate colonies and have an economy that retired the debt. It's a big debt that the U.S. had for revolution in terms of money owed to veterans, money owed to the states, agreed to form the Federal Union, money owed to France. And that Bank of the United States took the debt and converted it into shares in this bank, credit that led to the building of the canal systems, later railroads, and that's how the United States, and that we're not part of the British Empire. And when Roosevelt came in, I'm sorry, when Churchill came into Fulton, Missouri, the president was no longer Franklin Roosevelt. He had died April 12th, 1945.
Mm.
And Truman, who was a little man, went along with the British. Actually, it was Truman, Democratic Party, who dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yep.
Never should have been. Huh? The British were manipulating Truman and West, in effect, to go against the American revolutionary system
Mm-hmm.
and to become part of, a new of a globalist empire around there when Churchill was there in 46. But
Mm-hmm.
that's the problem we've been through in all our lives, is the constant U.S. getting dragged into wars, from the Korean War to the Vietnam War to the Gulf War to the Iraq War to the Libya War. And this, if the U.S. keeps going along with the British, we're going to end up in World War one way or another.
Yeah.
And so that's what LaRouche PAC, Lyndon LaRouche's Political Action Committee, is really providing this understanding to the grassroots. The grassroots. Unfortunately, none of the congressmen of the Democratic Party have broken loose and spoken out against the war. On the other hand, former President Donald Trump actually has made ending the war is the leading anti-war candidate right now.
Mm-hmm.
And people like Matt Gaetz, congressman from Florida, have actually put bills in calling for ending the funding to Ukraine,
Okay.
to the war.
Yeah.
So our job is to mobilize, and I think that's really what you got in mind, is we just can't let this country go to hell because people don't know what's really up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's still, it's so ridiculous when the news talks about, the corporate media talks about it. It's like the very first event was that Russia invaded Ukraine, and then everything starts from there, and no background, no issues, no discussion about the coup in 2014. It's people don't ask. They don't even know to ask. Well, what happened in 2014? And I've seen a couple of videos. I mean, it was brutal. The neo-Nazis over there that backed Zelensky, and the CIA was backing them, and it was a mess. And I don't know.
Yeah,
Seems
this is a
like,
very. I'm glad you brought that up, because George Eliasson was interviewing the deputy Russian minister to the United Nations, Dmitry Polyansky,
mhm.
who had spoken at one of our at actually the conference that we had when Mr. LaRouche passed away in 2019. He had come in and given remarks honoring LaRouche for his efforts, at
Mhm.
trying to solve this. And what they were discussing, which was really remarkable, I didn't know it, was up to the day of the Russian invasion, or the Russian what's called the special military operation in Ukraine today. The Russians were still trying to get an implementation or a commitment to implementation of the Minsk agreements. Like the 2 or 3 days right before the war, Russia was trying to have a negotiation to prevent any kind of, military action from starting.
Mhm.
And as you probably know, the head of Germany, Merkel, and the head of France, Hollande, have said they only made that Minsk agreement after the coup that you talked about on the Maidan in 2014.
Mhm.
They only made that agreement with no intention of actually carrying it out.
Yeah, it was just to give them time to arm, to get arms in
Give
there.
Ukraine time to arm. And the big debate that George Eliasson and this Russian um, deputy UN official Polanski were having is, why didn't Russia do something sooner? Why? Because they've been killing people after that coup on the Maidan. The neo-Nazi elements were roaming around to exterminate people,
Mhm.
in the Donbass. And the kind of like the National Guard or the militia groups of Donbass were actually kicking the shit out of the Ukrainian Nazis. And then that peace agreement, that Minsk agreement, where Russia, France, Germany were the guarantors, actually stopped the Donbass militias from defeating the Ukrainians, Nazis, under the guise they were going to protect them.
Hmm.
So Russia, by coming in with the peace with Hollande and Merkel, actually stopped the war at that point.
Mhm.
They were the peacemakers. And so it kind of, the question became in this discussion today, why should Russia believe anything coming out of Joe Biden or any of the Western European leaders' mouths?
Exactly.
They just made a peace agreement and then admitted they made it only to build up stronger military Ukraine.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and then, like you said, it's like you're supposed to have you brainwashed and not even ask the questions that you asked. Is there some history here that you're leaving out? So yeah, there's a lot of history they're leaving out.
Yeah, I think a lot of that Russiagate, all this, yes, crazy stuff that Hillary Clinton brought up, I think that got a lot of the population hating Putin, and they don't know why. They just think, oh my God, he's terrible and all this. And yeah, like Trump said, I mean, yeah, Putin's not a great guy, but he's got a country to run. And when he's encircled, you should see the map of all of the military bases that the United States has. I mean, we are encircling Russia and China. It's crazy. I mean, that's I guess where a lot of the trillions of dollars are going.
Yeah,
But they're scared shitless. I can see why they are. Well, if you're going to take us, then we're going to just take the whole world down with us. That's all they
well,
got left.
I'm glad you brought up this Russia stuff, because and we discussed some of this last time, a few weeks back, with the material coming out from Elon Musk on the Twitter files. It turns out the intelligence agencies were actually responsible for the censorship of and spreading the disinformation, and that anyone, it could be Terry Allen of Real Progress News, or it could be Consortium News, it could be anyone who came out and said that Russia was a fraud. Russia never hacked the DNC computers, huh?
Yep.
And anyone who said that, boom, censored. Anyone
Yep.
who said COVID may have come out of a lab, censored. You know, and
Yep.
and so what we're finding is there has been no, they go around saying, well, we're in a war in Ukraine because it's a war of democracy versus the authoritarian, authoritarian authorities of,
Yep.
dictatorship. And then if you try to say something that shows these guys were censoring, they've been the authoritarian dictators, boom, you get wiped out, you get censored. So this faction, this grouping that pushed the Cold War with Churchill's speech on this day in 1946, they have been pushing for permanent, forever wars,
Yep.
eternal wars. From the day you live to the day you die is going to be war. It's never going to end. Huh?
Yeah. Now you can see why they're doing it. I mean, same thing with the British and the French years ago, centuries ago. Well, the 30 Years' War has just churned that money.
Yeah,
I don't know if it was Trump that said it. Somebody was that half of the $100 billion that have gone over there. It's just Zelensky and these people are stuffing it in bank accounts in Cyprus. They've been selling these weapons on the open market. We got U.S. weapons all over the place. I mean, this is insane. It's like a giant money laundering operation. Something. It's like,
yeah.
wow.
And you remember when there was an attempt to crack down on this, Burisma and the other oligarchs of Ukraine who were dealing with the Bidens, who were dealing with, people from the CIA who were part of this.
Oh.
Huh? That was all put under, shut up, you can't say it, it's Russian disinformation. And when Zelensky actually ran for president, his platform was to end the war.
Yeah.
He got 70-something% of the vote on the platform of meeting with Putin, making peace, and ending the war that had started after the coup in 2014. And even as late as after this thing started, February 2022, Russia and Ukraine were in negotiations by March and actually were close to an agreement when the British Prime Minister at that time, Boris Johnson, came into Ukraine and said, no peace.
We're not ready for peace yet.
Yeah. So here you got the British. Where's the democracy of the British coming into Ukraine and telling them they can't have peace when they were on the verge of signing peace? So I think whether you look at World War II, whether you look at how the British got us into Vietnam, whether you look at Tony Blair, for example. Now, there's a good example.
Yeah.
Tony Blair made up the lie about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Yeah, he was part of that. Yeah.
Yep. And said, the Iraqis got weapons that could hit London in 45 minutes,
Yeah.
and it was straight out lies. And yet well, because he was such a good liar, quote unquote, Tony Blair is now Sir Tony Blair. He's been knighted in the British Empire. So if you actually do your homework, do your due diligence, you will find out that all of these wars in post-war comes down to, if Franklin Roosevelt were still alive, we would have had a development orientation based on raising the living standards, of people, from the underdeveloped sector. There was a big fight between Roosevelt and Churchill about India, for example. That's where Lyndon LaRouche was in World War II. He was in India. He saw the British carry out massacres of innocent people who were, quote, guilty of calling for being independent.
Yeah.
Having independence from the British Empire. So where's all the documentaries about how many people the British have murdered? You're interested in stopping murder? well, you better do a documentary on how many tens and hundreds of millions have been murdered by the British Empire.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's why, go
This
ahead.
whole Nord Stream pipeline thing too. I think the British were kind of involved in that. I mean, it sure looks like the United States did it, but probably with the British help. Do you have any more information from George on that?
Well, what George and other people have said is the British were the first ones on the scene. So if the object of this whole thing is just to let Biden take the rap so that, and again, unfortunately, I was a Democrat for a long time, Democratic Party, Eugene McCarthy, people wanted a anti-war,
Yep.
and that was JFK, so unfortunately, the Democratic Party has been taken over by people like Soros, and Soros, I remember the ties between Soros and Halliburton, during the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
Soros, is funding all of these so-called radical groups who, you want. Another thing George went over again is that the Azov Nazi battalion members were actually part of the setup of January 6th. They were part of creating the chaos to be blamed on Donald Trump for what the FBI, Azovs, who they're probably, and apparently this is going to come out this week because they've turned over thousands of hours of videotapes that were available to Tucker Carlson,
Yeah.
and he's talked about having some really dynamite exposure of what really happened on January 6th, this week. So a lot of this, what we used to call the secret government.
Yeah, deep state, all that.
The deep state.
The shadow government.
All right, the shadow government. A lot of this stuff has actually now, because of Elon Musk, because of also what happened in Congress with Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, and others from the Freedom Caucus who would not vote for Kevin McCarthy for Speaker for like 15 votes to force McCarthy to make concessions he otherwise wouldn't have made. Yeah. And so when people who were demonstrating against the war, on February 19th, the Sunday, Rage Against the War demonstration, when they went to Capitol Hill the next few days, they got a come in, sit down, let's talk at Kevin McCarthy's office for 45 minutes. If you have top aides of the Speaker of the House willing to listen to left-wing, right-wing, center-wing, people to stop war for 45 minutes, who then go over to Hakeem Jeffries' office, the minority leader, chief Democrat, who barely wouldn't even let him in the door.
Of course.
This really tells you what time it is. And I would really ask all the listeners to actually get a hold of their congressman as if your life depends on it, because your life may depend on stopping this war. And the one place where we have the opportunity to do it is right here in the USA. If the USA, and Trump made a speech about this at the CPAC conference.
Yeah, I saw some of that. Yeah.
Yep. And we here, LaRouche PAC in California, we have delegates who will be going, including my wife, who's a delegate to the Republican State Convention coming up next weekend.
Yeah.
And we have a resolution, I sent it to you, Terry, that calls for Trump to be brought in to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia to stop the war.
Okay.
We passed that resolution in the Alameda County area in the Republican Central Committee. We passed it with a 2/3 vote. And now we're going to try to get it through the entire Republican Party. There'll be about 1,500 delegates in Sacramento this coming weekend. And we actually officially got it onto the resolutions committee for consideration.
Mhm.
So it really, your life depends on it. It does. And I think, just if I might say, there was an election where you and I were for years, Illinois. There was an election for mayor of Chicago this week, and the Soros candidate was defeated, Mayor Lori Lightfoot.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Who was one of these,
Wacky.
Yep. Everything goes. If you get robbed, tough luck,
Yeah.
And Chicago, which, from the time you and I were there, used to be a major industrial, steel works, auto plants, machine tools. And now it's
just a hollowed out, it's
Yep.
terrible. Yeah, it was really funny because this thing is going on now with the Democratic Party, and there's been some fights about the election and everything, and they're so shocked. They're saying like, we can't do anything in court. And I remember what was it back in the 80s when we went to court over the Houston election, and the court finally just said, well, the Democratic Party is a private club. They can exclude anybody they want. And
How about that?
And it's happening again. And everybody's like, wow, I can't believe it. Well, it's always been like that.
Yep.
It's crazy. These our democracy basically is set at the feet of a couple of private parties, essentially, that all have, cocktail parties together in Martha's Vineyard. I mean, it's really sick. It's really sick. Our lives depend on these scumbags. I hope the Republicans do something. I would love to see it, but it's like I was listening to the some of that hearing, and the Democrats are pretending like this is all fairy tales and there's nothing here to see, and it's blatant. I mean, they censored, the government censored. They came in with the FBI, with Twitter, and they colluded to do this. It's so freaking obvious, and how the Democrats can pretend like it's all fantasy. It's just staggering. I just don't know how they can do it unless they're on drugs or something. It doesn't make any sense. They're wired up to something. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Terry, I understand you're going to have another interview with Brian Lance from LaRouche PAC, because
technical difficulties.
Yeah. Get them straightened out. But I just want to emphasize to people watching or listening that LaRouche PAC has a very strong Operation Prometheus for reconstruction and picking up where John Kennedy, picking up where Roosevelt would have gone had those two presidents, lived. Kennedy assassinated, Roosevelt, died. So Lyndon LaRouche solutions based on science, based on the increasing of production capabilities of agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure. And Brian Lance has done a unique study, a groundbreaking study on how our defense and aerospace plants can be brought into a civilian reconstruction effort, much like the auto plants were done.
In reverse, sort of like.
Yeah. So I would ask you to help circulate. I did send you the resolution, and if you could share that with your viewers.
I'll put that on the description below.
Yep. And ask them to contact their congressman. I think that's the best thing people could do, in the immediate situation.
Yeah, I do have a question that I saw some of the speech that Trump gave at CPAC, and one of the things that concerns me is that he wanted to stop the Nord Stream pipeline also. He's kind of saying, well, hey, you should be buying oil and gas from us, not from Russia. And then he's basically Now, he wasn't talking about the history of Ukraine and Russia conflict and the Zelensky, the coup and all that. He wasn't mentioning anything about that either. So he's got to know what really happened. Is he just kind of like glazing over it, or it's like kind of worrisome?
Well, I would say this, and I was recalling for some people, I was at a press conference with Ronald Reagan in 1986 at O'Hare Airport.
Mhm.
And one of the reporters said, Mr. Reagan, did you come here to Illinois to support LaRouche? Because, LaRouche candidates won elections for statewide offices.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And Reagan's answer was to Basil Talbot of the Sun-Times, um, a little chuckle,
Yeah.
would move his head a little and said, I can't say, I agree with everything LaRouche says.
Yeah.
Next question, please.
That's what they always say.
Right.
Yeah.
So when it comes to someone who, is in a situation where they got a gun pointed at their head, and remember, Reagan did get shot.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think the key to dealing with that kind of problem is having a movement of the citizens, so you don't just depend on one person, to do everything, because A, they're under pressure, and B, they may not know as much as you and I know about who's really who. Now, it's hard for me to say exactly, but the fact that the Russia gang, just like Merkel and Hollande, they did not want to see a peace because they wanted to get this war going. And I think as if Trump had not been under this, Russia, and then the Ukraine, and then impeachment 1, impeachment 2, this war wouldn't even be happening. So we wouldn't even be discussing, who blew up Nord Stream,
Right.
because it never would happen. So, but that's what I can offer as a way out is don't just say I'm a smart guy and I know what he should have done and she should have done, and he didn't do what she did and she did what he. No, what are you going to do?
Exactly.
How are you going to take responsibility? And that's what LaRouche PAC is all about. Not saying, we're going to hide behind someone's skirt, or we're going to hide behind, there's some powerful force out there that's going to solve the problem, and we're going to sit here and,
watch it happen. Yeah.
Watch it. Exactly. And if they don't do it, then you can throw your shoe at the TV and say there's something real. But the question is the role of the citizen in a republic and in a situation where it's a crisis to rise up from your particular job or circumstance and to say, I'm responsible to the future, for the future generations. And if we do that, I think that's what you and I know. That's
our role in our life. Something. We have about a minute left, and maybe you could give some of the websites and the addresses and who to contact and all that kind of stuff if people needs any information.
Yeah, and you just put in www.larouchepac.com is the website.
Yeah.
And
how do you spell LaRouche? It's LaRouche.
E.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. LaRouchePAC.com. And we're running a whole series on what is the history of the deep state.
Yes, that would be interesting.
Yep. So we're having regular postings. I think we've had about 4 of them so far about George Bush family. We can talk more about this. The Bushes are behind Ron DeSantis. He's getting a lot of money from the hedge funds. He's getting a lot of support from Jeb Bush. And again, when Trump ran, remember, He defeated Bush.
He
with more-
destroyed Jeb Bush. That was so
Right.
funny to watch on the stage as he crumbled. That
Yep.
was great. I love
Yep.
that. Okay, that's it for this evening. It is March 5th, Sunday evening, 2023. And this is Real Progress News. Terry Allen, my guest was Gerald Pechenuk from the Lush Organization. And we are going to have a couple of more interviews this week. A couple of really interesting things are coming up because this is heating up with the Twitter dumps and this video footage that's come out that Tucker Carlson is going to be releasing. We knew it was the FBI that did this. Now we got the proof. Now it's all going to come out, and hopefully this is going to take down the deep state. That's what we've got to do. We've got to clean house and start over, basically. So this is Terry Allen signing off. Have a good night. Peace.